We're going to turn the page here now to some big news here in the United States. That is the struggle of auto workers for dignity on the job. And we are very, very honored to be joined here by Denny Butler, who is the vice president of UAW Local 685. Mr. Butler, thanks so much for being with us.
Hey, I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Well, we really appreciate having you here. Obviously, the deadline is tonight. You all may have to take action to get what you need there. And just give us a sense of what it is that auto workers are asking for in terms of the contracts this time around.
I think they're not asking for the moon. I think they're asking for their fair share. Historically, in the last 10 years, you've seen the auto companies make record profits. I think President Fain makes it real clear it's $250 billion, and the auto workers' pay has stayed stagnant. And we're just normal people that live in communities that raise families, and we just want a fair share at being able to do that without having to work two jobs. I mean, there's a majority of our membership here locally and corporate wide at all three of the automakers that can't afford to buy what we build, and there's something wrong with that.
Can you maybe lay out for our viewers the conditions that your average worker has to deal with that obviously you're trying to make better, just to give them an idea of what workers are struggling with in this situation?
I think a lot of the workers, we've got a plant here locally that has been forced 12 hours a day, 7 days a week in a critical status. And from the time that the plant was first fired up until, just probably within the last 2 or 3 weeks that we went up there to get an update, there's not a whole lot that has changed. And I know it was probably a terrible launch to begin with, but at the same time, it's on the heels of our employees and our workers that are making these profits for these companies. And like I said, they're not asking for the moon. They're not asking for anything that they don't deserve. They're asking for a fair share that will help these families.
I think that's an incredibly important aspect. And I mean, the other, I think, piece of that I was hoping you could speak to is, auto workers made a lot of concessions in the 2008, 2009 economic crisis to keep these companies from going under. So in some ways, it's almost like, this is almost like payback for the fact that you guys were willing to make some big sacrifices in order to keep the auto industry alive.
I think a lot of people have forgotten about that, and it was the taxpayers that footed the bill for these companies, to stay alive. And don't get me wrong, I think it was the right decision back in the Obama era to bail the companies out, because it would have had a far-reaching effect of more than just hundreds of thousands of auto workers. You're talking about independent parts suppliers, and I mean, take a look at what happened just in the last 3 years when the pandemic, or 4 years when the pandemic started. I mean, there's a lot of companies that went out of business. And the things that happened back in the bankruptcy and since the bankruptcy, like I said, the American auto worker has fallen way behind in comparison to what these CEOs are getting compensated at.
So can you remind our audience, okay, what are the workers asking for in the situation? And then what has been the reaction up until now? Obviously there's this looming deadline, but what has been the reaction of the companies so far?
I think the companies were slow to realize that this was probably the most important contract in recent years or recent history when it comes to negotiating with the UAW. It just all falls back to the fact that the companies have left their employees out. I mean, we make good wages, but when you take into inflation, for example, I mean, when's the last time you went to the grocery store and bought some groceries, a gallon of milk, a loaf of bread? I mean, things have skyrocketed, and they took our cost of living away when we negotiated these bailouts back in 2007, 2009. We haven't gotten any of that back. We haven't had the cost of living, and our wages have stayed stagnant in comparison to the increases in the profits of the companies and the increases in the compensation for these CEOs. It's when a CEO makes $29 million in a year. I don't think the two of you that are hosting this show and me, if we threw all of our salaries included in 35 years, we're not going to make anywhere close to $29 million. Mm-hmm. And if we are, it's I need to come on and start working with you two. But I mean, that's terrible when you preach and you try to unionism and solidarity is the prime example, or the number one thing that people think about when it comes to the UAW. Or what I think about is solidarity and everybody sticking together. And there's nothing that screams anti-solidarity that it is, other than these tiers and these people doing the same work and not receiving the same pay. I hired in '98. I qualify for the 30 and out. I get a pension. I get health care after retirement, and these tiers have created this situation to where these people don't get treated the same, and that is totally against anything that the UAW has ever stood for.
One of the factors that, has been playing a big role is or a big part of the conversation, at least in the media, is this issue of electric vehicles. And I think, many people around the country can appreciate the need to address climate change. But it seems, at least to me, this is just my perception, but I wonder what you think about this, that a lot of the rhetoric coming from the companies about wanting to switch to electric vehicles and make new investments and so on and so forth seems to be kind of a smokescreen to eliminate workers, or at least to move factories to non-union areas. It doesn't seem as if it's really what it's sold to be.
Well, I think there was a documentary, and I can't remember what news agency put it on, but one of the guys that did the documentary took an electric vehicle, and I think it was somewhere like around Chicago, and traveled down to like New Orleans. And I think it took them like 3 days, and they spent more time sleeping and waiting on the car to charge than it took for them to actually spend time on the road. But here's the thing. Everybody and their brother knows that our infrastructure nationwide is not ready for a full electric car, or everybody going out and buying an electric car right now. I mean, the electrical grid is not prepared. Like I said, there's not the number of electric charging stations that are ready for this. And I'll speak to, we've got a battery plant going up right in our own backyard over here, right across the street from one of our UAW locals here in town, 1166. I mean, it's right across. You pull out of their exit, and there's the battery plant being built. And that right now is not under the UAW umbrella. And there's just something completely wrong with that.
Yeah, that's an important point. And I have been reading in every article. There's been like at least a line in every mainstream article, at least in the corporate media, noting this argument by the automakers of, yes, so we're like the transition. We won't have money to spend on the transition to electric if we do this. I wanted to also ask you, and maybe this is unfair to ask you to comment on what seems like a nationwide issue, but I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on this. Is there does seem to be in the last year or couple of years many strikes across various industries, whether we're talking about, UPS, Amazon, in terms of unionizing in Amazon and then UPS striking, or whether we're talking about like Waffle House, employees or Starbucks employees. And obviously this is a different industry. It's automaking. But I'm just curious if you see a trend in terms of workers across America pushing back a bit against what does seem to be a lot of what you're talking about in this particular industry. You can just like kind of cookie cutter use the same explanation for what's going on in other companies and industries where, you've got CEOs making a lot of money, the working conditions are terrible, people aren't being compensated enough, they're not getting the benefits they need, some people are having to work two jobs, and on and on and on. I'm just curious your thoughts on that general observation.
Well, all I can say is, if we're going to base it on what just happened with the UPS strike and what their salary is going to be at the end of their contract, it's time. I think historically the public hasn't supported unions, whether or not it's the UAW or the AFLI or AFL-CIO or the IBEW. Yeah, I think historically the general public has not truly understood what the UAW stands for. But as of late, I think they've had a couple polls that they've taken, and I mean, the general sentiment of the general public is like around 75% are starting to, supporting the union, and I think 80% of that percentage is like 30 and under people. So whatever we're doing is starting to work. And I think the general consensus is we're actually not spoiled, overpaid auto workers. I mean, when these companies want to preach about, if they give in to our demands, it's going to increase the cost of vehicles. I think President Fain mentioned it yesterday at our rally on the video that he sent down here to Kokomo, and commented at the fact that the price of the car is 10% of our is the 10% of the price of a car is related to our benefit package and our wages. But the price of vehicles has soared, 30 to 35% in the last 3 or 4 years. Our wages, like I said, have stayed stagnant. It's the union. We're not out asking for anything that we don't deserve. We're just asking for a fair shake.
Mm-hmm. And I think certainly from what I see, there are people around the country who are, 100% ready to support you guys. If you do have to go out, we'll see what happens here. But if there is some sort of strike that does have to take place, for community members who are looking to support you all, what are you asking people to do if it reaches that stage?
I think everybody just needs to stick together. We're just not we're not the three automakers. The UAW is bigger than that. It's the IPS, it's nurses, it's casino workers, it's graduate students, researchers. We're just normal people that want to raise our families and be able to pay for our kids to go to college if that's our choice. And it's not just the UAW workers that are going to suffer. It's communities, it's grocery stores, it's mom and pop shops here locally that, if they don't have, the landscape could totally change in these communities. I mean, look at some of the communities where some of the big three have shut down auto plants. I mean, those landscapes in those communities is totally different now. I mean, my mom retired from Delco here in Kokomo, Indiana, and I can remember back in the day, she was a clerk, and when we wanted to go see her, I mean, you didn't have cell phones, you couldn't reach them, but there were several different plants here in Kokomo, and that was home to UAW Local 292. And at one time, I think they had over 17,000 employees in this city, and they're down to 100 employees that are left at that plant. So we're normal people, man, and we're nothing special, but we're part of our community. We send our kids to school. We got ball games and ball fields that we go to that we support. We're not asking for the moon. We're just asking for a fair shake to raise our families.
No, for sure. I hear that 100%. And we really appreciate you giving us some of your very valuable time here on the Freedom Side. Mr. Denny Butler, Vice President of UAW Local 685.
Thank you. Appreciate it.